Penetration pricing is another kind of second-degree price discrimination. Here, the essential idea is that the firm is going to charge a low price initially to new customers. Its goal is to gradually raise that price, so the customers it attracts will hopefully be willing to pay that higher price. Why would they be willing to do that? Well, one possibility is that the good that's being offered is what I've called an experience good. So customers need to actually sample the good. They need to try it before they know what their true willingness to pay is. This is quite commonly done with things like newspapers or magazines, or perhaps access to websites. It's important for goods which are purchased repeatedly because, after all, there's no point in offering a low initial price to somebody who rarely would buy that good. So if you think about newspapers or magazines that come out on a regular basis, then those goods are being purchased on a repeated basis. Another possibility, if we just think of examples of this, is the pricing behavior that telecommunications companies often employ. So recently, for example, somebody came and knocked on my door and offered me a low initial price for my internet service and phone service. The idea is that I'm going to pay that low price for maybe a year or two, and then gradually they're going to increase that price. Well, how do they know that I'm likely to put up with those price increases? One possibility is the idea of switching costs that we've seen before. So, as they raise the price in the future, there's going to be some cost to me in going and finding a new supplier, returning my rented equipment, and so on. So I may not put up with that hassle. I may just carry on and pay a somewhat higher price. Another example is this example I looked up of a kind of experience good. If you go to the Aquatic Center in St. John, you can have a 1-week free trial. Apparently the YMCA also offers free trials as well. So those are classic cases of experience goods. Another kind of price discrimination takes place through tying. The idea of tying is something that we've seen before. It's the tying or the connecting of the purchase of one good to the purchase of another. Usually this happens because the goods need to be used together in order for both of them to be of some use. Well, why does this constitute price discrimination? What we're trying to do in this case is to discriminate between buyers who value the product more highly and those who don't. Typically, those who would use the product more would value it more highly. So perhaps by tying the goods together, we can identify those users, those purchasers, who would use it more. Let's just consider an example. The university uses machines like this that are made by the Scantron Corporation to mark multiple choice tests. There's a whole variety of different machines and different kinds of special cards that come with those machines. So the machines will only read these special cards that have been produced by the Scantron Corporation. So you can buy the machine for a separate price, but you also have to buy the cards. So clearly, the more cards you buy, the more heavily you're using the machine. So these cards are really quite expensive. A package of 500 of these little cards costs $60, which works out to about 12 cents a page, and surely that is far, far higher than the marginal cost, which is probably just a fraction of a cent. So this is a kind of discrimination, because what you're able to do is effectively, by tying these two goods together, you're charging a much higher price overall to the heavy users of the machines. Those who don't use the machines very often, and therefore don't use many cards, are not going to pay as high a price. Well, it's possible that, as we've seen before in the course, that tying could be illegal. Of course, whether tying is illegal depends on the laws of particular countries. But in Canada, tying is illegal whenever it reduces the competition in a market. So, just to put it in very general terms, if you have a firm, I'm calling it a dominant firm in the market for a particular good, and that firm requires the buyers of that good also buy some separate product, I'm just calling it Y here, then that would mean that they can't buy substitutes for Y that are produced by competing firms. So effectively what the firm is doing is reducing competition in the market for good Y by using its monopoly power in the X market to reduce competition in Y. So just to give you an example, suppose that X was advertising in a newspaper, and that newspaper, let's say, was a monopoly. So in many cities in both Canada and the United States, there's really only room for a single newspaper. So the market for newspaper advertising is essentially a monopoly. If the corporation that owned the newspaper also owned a radio station that sold advertising time, and that radio station competed with other radio stations for radio advertising, if it said to its customers who wanted to advertise in the newspaper, you must also only buy advertising on our radio station if you want to advertise in our newspaper, that would be illegal tying in Canada. And the competition for, in this case, radio advertising would be reduced. Well, what kinds of tying are legal or illegal is, of course, going to depend on individual countries' laws. There's another kind of price discrimination, which is called setting two-part tariffs or prices. A tariff is really just another word for a price in this case. So here, the essential idea is that we're going to have two separate prices for a good or a service. The first part is a fee or a tariff that allows the customer to be able to buy at least some of the product. The second part of the price is a per unit price. So the overall price is really divided up into these two parts. What's the point of this? Well, compared to simply setting a single price for each unit of the product, what the seller is doing is trying to collect some additional consumer surplus to add that to profit contribution. Well, think of some examples where products have essentially two prices. It's easy to think of examples if you think of that first part as simply a fee or a charge that allows the buyer to use the good. So, for example, if you consider membership fees in clubs, so if you could only use the club if you purchased a membership fee, then that would be a two-part tariff. Some credit cards come with an annual charge. So if you want to use the credit card, you have to pay that fee. Sometimes if you want to have a new phone service, there'll be a connection fee. Some utilities charge monthly fees for their services. Well, there are many other examples. Let's just think about what the purpose of this is in terms of collecting consumer surplus. So I've given you an exercise number 3, to give you some practice in just thinking about what the idea looks like in the theoretical framework that we've been using. So if you've got exercise 3 and haven't used it, spend a little time working out the answers to those questions now, and then you can continue with this video. Well, I'm going to consider just a very simple example, just supposing that we've got a bunch of customers who all have the same willingness to pay, so that I'm just going to add up their demand for a particular product and consider how we could implement two-part pricing. The discussion really parallels the exercise number 3. In principle, if we knew demand, we could capture the entire consumer surplus with our two-part pricing. This picture shows us the total demand by our customers, and we can see where the two-part pricing comes in. So there's going to be a price for the use of this good or this service. So there's a price per unit, and there's going to be a second part. Let's call it a fee or a tariff. We can think of it as a membership fee, which in this case could, in principle, capture the entire consumer surplus if we knew what willingness to pay was. So our profit contribution really comes from two separate parts. First, the price per unit that we see here, the typical profit contribution we've seen before, and the membership fee is a second part of profit contribution that essentially takes all of consumer surplus in this case. Well, of course, it's possible that if we don't actually know what consumers' demand is going to be, we might set the fee too high, and then customers aren't going to buy anything, because, of course, if we set this as the price and we set a fee that exceeds consumer surplus, obviously our customers would be better off not buying anything. So we don't want to do that. Probably then a more realistic situation would be that we would only capture part of consumer surplus with our two-part pricing scheme. So if we consider just some particular individual, it's very unlikely that our membership fee is going to capture the entire consumer surplus, but it might take a little chunk out of it anyway. So profit contribution in this case would be the contribution from charging the individual price and charging a membership fee. The exercise asked whether there was a trade-off between these two. Well, clearly there is, because the higher the price we charge, if you imagine, say, a higher price per unit, that's going to leave consumer surplus being smaller. So that leaves less room to charge a membership fee. On the other hand, if we charge a very large membership fee, then that's going to mean that we would have to charge a lower price. So, just to briefly summarize, the idea of two-part pricing is to just take one step beyond the simple idea of charging a single price. It recognizes that our buyers are getting some consumer surplus, and that by charging a second price, some sort of access fee, a membership fee, whatever you want to call it, we may be able to add a little bit to profit contribution. There is the risk, of course, of pricing some customers out of the market, because some might think that that fee is just too large if their consumer surplus is really quite small. So the idea of that second price must be that the extra profit contribution that we get from the customers who remain with us more than offsets the business that we would lose by charging the membership fee.